The boy did not cry when they found him. Snow had swallowed the wagon whole by morning, leaving only one broken wheel sticking out of the drift like a grave marker. The wind had long since erased the tracks leading in or out. It was Caleb Mercer's horse that stopped first, nostrils flaring, hooves pawing at the frozen earth as if it sensed something human buried beneath the silence. Caleb saw the small hand before he saw the body. It was sticking out from under the canvas, blue from the cold but stiff in a way that told him the child was still alive. He dismounted without thinking, boots sinking into the snow, fingers already tearing through the frost-hardened cloth. Beneath it lay a woman, pale and unmoving, and beside her, curled like he had simply laid down to nap, was a boy of no more than 7 years old. Welcome to First West Stories. Stories of our fathers. If you love our frontier legends and ancestors, drop a comment, like, share it with a friend, and subscribe. Most of all, stay till the very end, the wildest part is always waiting there. The boy's eyes were open. Not wide with fear. Not squeezed shut in grief. Just open. Watching. Caleb had seen that look before. Men wore it on battlefields when the smoke cleared and there was nothing left inside them but quiet. You alone? Caleb asked, voice low, careful, like one might speak to a wounded animal. The boy did not answer. He only looked past Caleb, toward the horizon. The town of Briar Hollow did not want another mouth to feed. By the time Caleb rode in with the boy wrapped in his coat, word had already spread that a wagon had been found frozen north of Miller's Creek. Folks gathered outside the general store as he dismounted, their expressions tight with curiosity and something sharper beneath it. That her? Mrs. Daughtry whispered. Caleb gave a short nod. She didn't make the night. And the boy? He did. There was a silence that followed, not relief, not sorrow. Calculation. Sheriff Collins stepped forward, adjusting his hat. Any kin? None that I could see, Caleb said. Well, the sheriff sighed, we can't have him roaming. Best send him to the Orphan rail in Wichita come spring. The boy stood beside Caleb's leg, silent as snow. That was when she stepped forward. Miss Eleanor Whitfield. The schoolteacher. You will not, she said quietly, but with a firmness that cut through the cold. The town turned. Eleanor Whitfield was not loud. She did not gossip. She did not smile much either. She had come from the East 3 years ago, bringing books and discipline and a spine made of iron. He is not freight to be shipped, she continued. He's a child. Sheriff Collins shifted. Miss Whitfield, the town can't. The town can, she interrupted, if the town chooses to. Her eyes moved then, not to the sheriff, not to the crowd. To Caleb. And in that look was something else. Expectation. Caleb Mercer did not like being looked at like that. He had spent 10 years building a life that required no one. A ranch far enough from town to avoid talk. Cattle enough to keep his hands busy. Silence enough to keep memories quiet. He did not want responsibility. He did not want attachment. He certainly did not want a boy who looked at the world like it had already taken everything from him. Yet when the sheriff cleared his throat and said, someone's got to house him until spring, the crowd's eyes moved, one by one, scanning faces and finding excuses. Too many children. Too little money. Too much trouble. Caleb felt the weight settle before he even opened his mouth. He can stay with me, he heard himself say. The words surprised him. The crowd murmured. Sheriff Collins blinked. You sure about that, Mercer? No. A few chuckles. But he ain't sleeping in a jail cell. The boy did not move. Did not react. Miss Whitfield's gaze softened, not into gratitude, but something steadier. Respect. The ride back to the ranch was quiet except for the wind. What's your name? Caleb asked after a mile. Silence. You got one, don't you? The boy stared ahead. Caleb exhaled. Suit yourself. They rode another stretch before a small voice, dry from cold and disuse, finally spoke. Thomas. Caleb nodded once. Thomas what? The pause stretched long. Then, Thomas Reed. Caleb swallowed. Reed. He had known a Reed once. Different war. Different grave. Well, Thomas Reed, he said evenly, you're about to meet the worst cook in Briar Hollow. For the first time, something flickered across the boy's face. Not a smile. But almost. The Mercer Ranch house had never held a child. It showed. Dust gathered where toys might have been. Silence hung thick in rooms too large for one man. The second bedroom had been used for storage, rope coils, old tack, a broken chair. Caleb cleared it out that evening. Thomas stood in the doorway watching as the cowboy dragged years of solitude into the hallway. "You don't have to," Thomas said suddenly. Caleb stopped. "Don't have to what?" "Make room." The words were careful. Measured. Caleb leaned the broken chair against the wall. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I do." Miss Whitfield arrived the next afternoon. Not to thank him. To inspect. She stepped inside with composed grace, gloves folded in her hand. Her eyes moved across the room, assessing dust, corners, warmth. "Does he have blankets?" she asked. "Yes." "Food?" "Yes." "Does he read?" Caleb hesitated. Thomas stood near the fireplace, small and stiff. "I don't know," Caleb admitted. Eleanor nodded once. "I'll come by after school," she said. "To teach him." Caleb frowned. "I didn't ask for." "No," she said gently. "But he deserves more than survival." Her eyes met his then. "And so do you." That night, Thomas woke screaming. Not loud. But sharp. The kind of sound that comes from somewhere buried deep. Caleb was in his doorway in seconds. The boy sat upright in bed, breathing hard, eyes wide but unfocused. "It's just a dream," Caleb said. Thomas shook his head. It wasn't a dream. Caleb did not ask. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed, awkward, uncertain, and waited. After a long moment, Thomas whispered, "She told me to run." Caleb felt something twist inside him. "And you didn't?" "I couldn't leave her." The silence that followed was heavier than snow. Caleb nodded slowly. "You won't have to leave anyone here," he said. He did not know if it was a promise. But it felt like one. By the end of the week, the town had begun to talk. They said Caleb Mercer was not fit to raise a boy. They said Miss Whitfield visited too often. They said loneliness made strange decisions. Caleb heard none of it. But Eleanor did. And when Mrs. Daughtry stopped her outside the post office to say, "You're tying yourself to a man who doesn't know how to be gentle," Eleanor replied calmly. Perhaps he was never given the chance. The first time Thomas laughed, it startled them both. Caleb had attempted to bake biscuits. They emerged from the oven blackened and hard enough to break teeth. Thomas stared at one. Then at Caleb. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. It was small. Rusty. But real. Caleb blinked. There it was. The sound the house had never known. Laughter. And in that moment, something shifted. Not dramatically. Not loudly. But permanently. And far from town, in the quiet dark of his ranch house, Caleb Mercer realized something that unsettled him more than loneliness ever had. He was no longer alone. And he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to be again. The house did not know what to do with mornings anymore. Before Thomas, Caleb Mercer's days had begun in silence, coffee boiled too long, boots pulled on without thought, the sun rising over cattle that asked no questions and expected no tenderness. But now there was the sound of smaller footsteps on wooden floors. The scrape of a chair being dragged too loudly. The hesitation before a door was opened, as if the boy inside was still unsure whether he had permission to exist there. On the fifth morning, Caleb woke to smoke. He was on his feet before the thought finished forming, pushing open the kitchen door with a hand already reaching for water. Thomas stood on a stool, gripping a skillet like it was a weapon. The stove flame was too high. Something inside the pan was black beyond recognition. "I was making eggs," Thomas said quickly, bracing himself for anger. Caleb looked at the smoke, then at the boy. "You planning to burn the place down, or just improve the flavor?" Thomas blinked. Caleb stepped forward, lowered the flame, and took the pan off the heat. He cracked 2 new eggs into a clean skillet. "You don't hold it that close," he said, adjusting Thomas's hand on the handle. "Let the heat do the work." Thomas watched carefully. He always watched carefully. Like everything was a lesson that might mean survival. Caleb slid the finished eggs onto a tin plate and handed it to him. Next time, Caleb added, we aim for yellow. Not coal. A pause. Then Thomas gave the smallest nod. It was not a smile. But it was closer than yesterday. Miss Eleanor Whitfield began coming every afternoon just after the schoolhouse emptied. She never knocked loudly. Just 2 firm taps, as though she expected the house to answer respectfully. The first week, she brought books. The second week, she brought paper and pencils. By the third week, she brought something far more dangerous. Patience. Thomas sat at the table, spine straight, eyes guarded. Caleb leaned against the far wall pretending to fix a bridle strap, though he hadn't moved his hands in several minutes. Read this line, Eleanor said gently. Thomas stared at the page. The horse runs. Good. And why does he run? Thomas hesitated. Caleb spoke without thinking. Because something's chasing him. Eleanor looked up at him. Or, she said evenly, because he chooses to. Caleb met her gaze. For a moment, neither looked away. Thomas cleared his throat softly and repeated, because he chooses to. Eleanor smiled, not brightly, not dramatically. Just enough. That's right. Caleb returned to his bridle, but something about that sentence lodged in him. Because he chooses to. The town's tolerance did not last long. It never did. 3 weeks after Thomas moved into the Mercer Ranch, Sheriff Colin rode out unannounced. Caleb met him outside. Everything legal, the sheriff asked casually, though his tone carried weight. As legal as taking in a half-frozen boy can be. Colin shifted in his saddle. There's talk. There's always talk. They're saying you don't have papers. No formal guardianship. If kin show up. They won't. And if they do. Caleb's jaw tightened. Then we'll deal with it. Colin sighed. You know the Davenport Ranch has already asked about him. Caleb's eyes sharpened. For what? Labor. The word hung between them like a threat. He's 7, Caleb said flatly. Davenport doesn't care much for numbers. Caleb stepped closer to the horse. You tell Davenport this, he said quietly. The boy's not cattle. Colin studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. I figured you'd say that. Thomas heard more than adults thought he did. That night, he stood in the doorway of Caleb's room. Am I going somewhere? Caleb sat up slowly. What? Sheriff said something about papers. Caleb rubbed a hand over his face. He had not prepared for this part. He had not prepared for explaining to a child that the world sometimes traded children like property. You staying here? Thomas pressed. Caleb swung his legs over the side of the bed and looked at him directly. You want to stay? Thomas did not answer immediately. Then, carefully, yes. That word carried more weight than any contract. Caleb nodded once. Then you're staying. Thomas searched his face for uncertainty. He did not find it. The first real crack in Thomas came a week later. Eleanor had been teaching him arithmetic when the sound of thunder rolled across the plains. The pencil snapped in his hand. His breathing changed. Caleb saw it first, the way the boy's shoulders locked, the way his eyes lost focus. It's just weather, Caleb said. But Thomas was already under the table. Thomas, Eleanor said gently, kneeling beside him. You're safe. The thunder rolled again. Thomas covered his ears. Caleb crouched down slowly. He did not reach for the boy immediately. He remembered the battlefield too clearly, remembered that sudden touch could feel like attack. Instead, he sat beside the table. I don't like thunder either, Caleb admitted quietly. Thomas glanced up, surprised. Sounds like cannon fire, Caleb continued. Used to make my hands shake. Eleanor looked at him sharply. Caleb kept his eyes on Thomas. But here's the thing, he said. No one's shooting. No one's dying. Just noise. The thunder faded slowly. Thomas's breathing steadied. After a long moment, he crawled out. He did not speak. But when he returned to his chair, he moved it closer to Caleb. The gossip grew teeth. Women at church stopped including Eleanor in conversation. A man at the saloon remarked too loudly that Caleb seemed eager to play house. Eleanor ignored most of it. Until one afternoon, Mrs. Daughtry cornered her outside the schoolhouse. "You're risking your reputation," the woman said sharply. "A single woman visiting a rancher's home daily. People notice." Eleanor met her gaze calmly. "I am teaching a child. You're involving yourself in something improper." "Improper," Eleanor repeated softly. "Would be abandoning him." Mrs. Daughtry pursed her lips. "Men like Caleb Mercer don't change." Eleanor's expression did not falter. "Perhaps," she said. "But children do. And that is worth the risk." Caleb noticed the way town eyes lingered when Eleanor walked beside him now. He noticed the way Thomas instinctively reached for his sleeve in crowded places. He noticed something else too. He did not resent it. One evening, as Eleanor packed her books, Caleb cleared his throat. "You don't have to keep coming," he said. "Not if it's causing trouble." Eleanor paused. "Is it causing trouble for you?" "I can handle trouble." She studied him for a long moment. "I know," she said quietly. "That is not what concerns me." The air shifted between them. Thomas, oblivious to adult tension, looked up from his page. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "Pa says I read better now." The word hit the room like a gunshot. Pa. Caleb froze. Eleanor's eyes moved slowly toward him. Thomas blinked, unaware of what he had done. Caleb swallowed once. "You do," he said finally. "Read better." Thomas returned to his book. Eleanor did not look away. "You didn't correct him," she observed softly. Caleb's voice was rougher than usual. "I didn't want to." That night, long after Thomas slept, Caleb sat on the porch alone. The plain stretched wide and dark before him. He had once believed solitude was strength. That needing no one made him invincible. But the truth was more uncomfortable. He had not been strong. He had been hiding. Inside the house, a boy slept who now called him Pa. Inside town, a woman defended his name without asking anything in return. He was no longer drifting. He was choosing. And choice, he realized, required courage of a different kind. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Mr. Davenport himself rode onto the ranch 3 days later. Tall. Wealthy. Accustomed to obedience. "I hear you're keeping a stray," Davenport said without greeting. Caleb stood calmly in the yard. "He's not stray." Davenport's gaze shifted to Thomas, who stood in the doorway. "You don't have papers." "Working on it." Davenport smiled thinly. "I could offer the boy a future. Work. Discipline. A proper arrangement." Thomas's hand tightened on the doorframe. Caleb stepped slightly to block Davenport's view. "He has a future. With you." Davenport scoffed. "You're one man." Caleb's voice dropped. "I'm enough." Davenport's smile vanished. "You think affection feeds a child?" "No," Caleb replied evenly. "But fear doesn't either." Silence. Then Davenport turned his horse. "This isn't finished," he warned. Caleb watched him ride away. Behind him, Thomas stepped closer. "Is he taking me?" Caleb did not hesitate. "No." That evening, Eleanor stayed longer than usual. Thomas practiced writing his full name, Thomas Reed Mercer. He did not ask permission. He simply wrote it. Eleanor saw. Caleb saw. Neither corrected him. When she finally gathered her things, she lingered near the door. "You're going to have to make it official," she said gently. "I know. They won't stop." "I know." She hesitated. "You don't have to do this alone." Caleb looked at her fully then. He saw not pity. Not obligation. But partnership. "I've been alone a long time," he admitted quietly. "And," she asked. "And I'm starting to think that was the mistake." Eleanor's breath caught, just slightly. Outside, the wind moved across the plains. Inside, something steadier took root. Not sudden love. Not reckless desire. But something stronger. Foundation. And in the small bedroom down the hall, Thomas slept without waking when thunder rolled. For the first time since the snow-covered wagon, he did not run. He stayed. Because he chose to. And because, without fully understanding how, he had found a house that no longer felt temporary. A house learning, slowly, how to become a home. The letter arrived folded in stiff white paper, sealed with the county's stamp and delivered by a boy who did not stay long enough to meet Caleb Mercer's eyes. Caleb stood in the yard when he broke it open. Thomas was mending a loose fence post nearby, tongue pressed between his teeth in concentration the way he always did when he wanted to prove he was useful. Useful. Caleb hated that word when it came to children. He read the letter once. Then again. Then he folded it carefully and slid it into his coat pocket as if it weighed nothing at all. "Who's it from?" Thomas asked without looking up. "County office," Caleb answered evenly. Thomas's hammer slowed. "Am I going somewhere?" The question was not loud. It did not need to be. Caleb walked over, crouched beside him, and adjusted the boy's grip on the nail. "You remember what I told you?" Thomas nodded faintly. "That you're staying." "That's right." Thomas searched his face carefully, like he was measuring truth against fear. Caleb did not look away. The hearing was set for the following Saturday. Temporary guardianship under review. Formal adoption challenged due to lack of documented kin verification and financial suitability. Davenport's name was not written in the letter. It did not have to be. By Wednesday, the town was buzzing like a hive struck with a stick. At the general store, voices lowered when Caleb entered. At church, Eleanor felt the shift, benches subtly moving away, hymns sung with less warmth. She ignored it. Until Sheriff Collins stepped into her classroom after dismissal. "You know about Saturday," he said. "I do. They're saying it's improper." Eleanor folded a stack of copybooks slowly. "They've said worse." Colin hesitated. "Davenport's pushing hard. Says he's offering stability. Claims Mercer's too isolated. Too rough." Eleanor's expression did not change. "Caleb Mercer is many things," she said calmly. "But he is not cruel." Colin sighed. "It's not cruelty they're arguing. It's suitability." Her gaze sharpened slightly. "Suitability," she repeated. "As defined by a man who sees children as labor." Colin didn't respond. He didn't need to. Thomas heard the word hearing whispered more times than he could count. He didn't fully understand what it meant. But he understood one thing. Adults only gathered in rooms like that when something was about to be taken. On Friday night, he sat at the kitchen table long after Eleanor had left. Caleb noticed. "You planning to sleep there?" Caleb asked lightly. Thomas didn't smile. "If they say no," he asked carefully, "do I have to go?" Caleb poured himself a cup of coffee he didn't want. "They might say I'm not official yet." Thomas swallowed. "So I go with that man." Caleb set the cup down untouched. "Look at me." Thomas did. "I fought in a war I didn't understand," Caleb said quietly. "I buried a brother because orders came too slow. I've lost things I don't talk about." Thomas listened without blinking. "But I will not lose you because someone with money thinks he owns more land than heart." The boy's breathing steadied. "You're staying," Caleb repeated. This time, it sounded less like reassurance. And more like vow. Saturday came gray and wind-bitten. The courthouse in Briar Hollow had never felt so crowded. Caleb stood at the front, hat in hand. Thomas sat beside him, boots not quite touching the floor. Eleanor entered last. She did not look at the crowd. She walked straight to the bench beside Caleb and sat down. The room noticed. Davenport stood near the opposite wall, arms folded, expression patient. The county clerk cleared his throat. "This hearing concerns the guardianship of Thomas Reed. Mr. Caleb Mercer has taken the child into his home following the death of his mother. Questions have been raised regarding formal adoption procedures and long-term suitability." Suitability again. Caleb's jaw tightened. Davenport stepped forward when called. "I bear no ill will toward Mr. Mercer," he began smoothly. "But the boy requires structure. A large operation. Other children. Education beyond ranch chores." Thomas's fingers tightened around the edge of the bench. Eleanor saw it. She placed her hand gently over his. Davenport continued. Mercer is a solitary man. No wife. No household support. Raising a child alone is no small task. Murmurs of agreement rippled. Then the clerk nodded toward Caleb. Your response. Caleb stepped forward slowly. He was not a polished speaker. He did not dress words in silk. But when he spoke, the room quieted. I didn't go looking for a son, he said plainly. Found him half buried in snow. Could have ridden past. Didn't. Silence. I don't have a big house. I don't have hired help. What I have is a roof, food, and a promise. He looked toward Thomas briefly. I won't break it. Davenport shifted. Promises don't build futures. No, Caleb agreed calmly. Character does. A few heads turned. Then, unexpectedly, Eleanor stood. Gasps followed. Miss Whitfield, the clerk said cautiously, you are not listed as party to this hearing. I am aware, she replied evenly. But I am witness. The room stiffened. She stepped forward. I have visited the Mercer Ranch daily for over a month. I have observed Mr. Mercer's conduct with the child. I have seen patience where others expected harshness. I have seen consistency where others predicted neglect. Her voice did not waver. Thomas Reed is not merely fed. He is listened to. He is taught. He is safe. Davenport's smile thinned. You are a schoolteacher, he said. Not a wife. The implication was sharp. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. No, she said. But I know the difference between control and care. A murmur moved through the crowd again, this time less certain. She turned slightly toward the clerk. If suitability is measured by acreage and income, then perhaps Mr. Davenport wins. But if it is measured by devotion, by presence, then I ask this court to look not at Mr. Mercer's land, but at the boy beside him. All I shifted to Thomas. He sat very still. Very small. Very brave. The clerk called him forward. Thomas walked slowly, boots echoing in the wooden room. Do you understand what this hearing is about? The clerk asked gently. Thomas hesitated. Yes, sir. And do you wish to remain with Mr. Mercer? The silence stretched long enough to hurt. Thomas looked at Caleb. Caleb did not nod. Did not gesture. He only watched. Thomas turned back. Yes, sir, he said firmly. Why? Thomas swallowed. Because he stays. A faint crease formed on the clerk's brow. Stays. When I have bad dreams, Thomas continued carefully, he stays. When thunder comes, he stays. When people talk, he stays. The room had gone completely still. He doesn't send me away. Something shifted then. Not loudly. But undeniably. The decision was not immediate. The clerk called for recess. Whispers filled the room like smoke. Davenport approached Caleb near the window. You think sentiment wins law? He asked quietly. Caleb's voice was steady. No. Davenport smirked. You're not equipped for this. Caleb held his gaze. I'm learning. Davenport glanced toward Eleanor across the room. And what happens when she tires of defending you? Caleb's eyes hardened slightly. She won't. Confidence. Not arrogance. Davenport studied him for a long moment. Then stepped back. When the hearing resumed, the clerk adjusted his spectacles. Given the child's expressed wishes and the absence of immediate kin claims, temporary guardianship shall remain with Mr. Mercer pending full adoption review. A breath left Caleb's chest he hadn't realized he was holding. However, the clerk continued, formal adoption will require demonstration of household stability and community endorsement. Community endorsement. The words landed heavily. The town still had power. The gavel struck once. The hearing ended. Outside, the wind had picked up. Thomas ran straight into Caleb's arms before remembering he was trying to be grown. Caleb held him anyway. You're staying, Caleb murmured. Thomas nodded against his coat. Eleanor approached slowly. It's not over, she said quietly. I know. The town was watching them. Measuring. Judging. Davenport mounted his horse without another word. This was not finished. That evening, Caleb stood alone in the pasture as the sun sank low. Community endorsement. He had never cared what Briar Hollow thought of him. Now he had to. Not for pride. For Thomas. He heard footsteps behind him. Eleanor. You spoke well, she said. I spoke plain. That's often better. They stood side by side, not touching. But they'll push harder, she added softly. Caleb nodded. I've never asked anyone to stand with me. Eleanor looked at him. Are you asking now? The question lingered between them. Caleb exhaled slowly. Yes. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest. Eleanor's eyes softened in a way the town had never seen. Then I will. Inside the house, Thomas practiced writing again. Thomas Reed Mercer. This time, he did not hesitate between the names. Outside, the plain stretched wide and uncertain. The town would test them. Davenport would maneuver. Rumors would sharpen. But something had changed. Caleb was no longer a man simply sheltering a child. He was fighting for him. And Eleanor was no longer merely visiting. She was choosing. The next battle would not be about temporary guardianship. It would be about proving that a family does not begin with approval. It begins with commitment. And Briar Hollow was about to learn the difference. The trouble began with a lie. It always did. Caleb heard it first from a ranch hand passing through town, a careless remark dropped like a spark in dry grass. They're saying you're only keeping the boy for sympathy, the man muttered near the watering trough. Claiming it'll help you secure that east pasture contract come spring. Caleb did not respond. But the words followed him home. Sympathy. As if he had calculated the weight of a child against profit. By the time he reached the ranch, the wind had picked up, carrying dust in restless spirals across the yard. Thomas was outside near the barn, carefully brushing down one of the smaller mares. He worked with quiet focus, speaking softly to the animal the way Caleb had shown him. You don't have to talk much, Caleb had told him once. Just let em know you're there. Thomas had taken that lesson to heart. Caleb watched him now, something tight in his chest. A boy who once wouldn't speak above a whisper now murmured reassurance to a horse twice his size. And the town thought that was manipulation. Inside the house, he found a folded paper on the table. It wasn't from the county. It was from Davenport. A formal petition had been filed demanding a full review of the adoption under claims of moral and structural instability within the Mercer household. Moral instability. Caleb's jaw flexed. He did not need the rest of the sentence spelled out. The rumors about Eleanor had reached Davenport's ears, and he was sharpening them into weapons. Eleanor heard before Caleb could warn her. 3 mothers withdrew their children from her class that afternoon. Mrs. Daughtry did not look at her when she said, "We prefer a teacher less entangled in scandal." Eleanor stood perfectly still. "What scandal?" she asked calmly. "You know very well," the woman replied. "Visiting a bachelor's ranch daily. Standing beside him in court. It's improper." Eleanor's spine straightened. "I am assisting in the education of a child. And perhaps pursuing something else." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor did not flinch. "If Briar Hollow measures a woman's virtue by her willingness to abandon a child," she said quietly, "then perhaps Briar Hollow should revisit its values." She gathered her books. She would not defend herself with shame. Thomas heard it at school the next day. Children were not subtle. "My pa says you're gonna get sent away. My ma says Miss Whitfield's gonna marry him just to make it look decent. My brother says Mr. Davenport's building a new bunkhouse and you'll be there soon." Thomas didn't respond. He just folded his hands tighter around his slate. But when one boy added, "Mercer ain't your real pa," something inside him cracked. He left before dismissal. He didn't run at first. He walked. Then walked faster. Then the wind swallowed him as he broke into a sprint across the open field. Caleb knew something was wrong before he saw the empty yard. Thomas's brush lay on the ground. The mare stood half-groomed. The house was too quiet. Caleb's pulse sharpened. "Thomas," he called. No answer. He checked the barn. The creak. The ridge beyond the fence. Nothing. Then he saw it, small boot prints heading west. Toward the open plains. Caleb's chest tightened. The storm clouds gathering on the horizon were not distant anymore. Eleanor was halfway to the ranch when she saw him ride past town at full speed. She didn't ask questions. She followed. The sky darkened quickly. Wind howled across the grasslands, flattening them in waves. Caleb rode hard, eyes scanning for movement. He found the boys' tracks near Miller's Creek. Heading toward the same cursed stretch of land where he had first found him in the snow. Caleb dismounted and followed on foot. "Thomas," he shouted into the wind. Thunder rolled. For a brief, terrible second, Caleb remembered another battlefield. Another storm. Another brother he had failed to reach in time. Not again. He pushed forward. He found Thomas crouched near a fallen cottonwood tree, arms wrapped around his knees. The boy was shaking. Not from cold. From something deeper. Caleb slowed as he approached. "You planning to start your own ranch out here?" he asked lightly, though his voice carried strain. Thomas didn't look up. "They're gonna send me away." "No. They said you don't really want me. That you're just," his voice broke. "Using me." The word felt filthy in the air. Caleb knelt slowly in front of him. "Look at me." Thomas resisted. Caleb waited. Finally, those storm-dark eyes lifted. "I don't keep things I don't want," Caleb said plainly. "I don't fight for things I don't care about." Thomas's breathing hitched. "You think I'd stand in that courtroom for profit?" Caleb continued. "You think I'd let Davenport circle like a vulture if I didn't mean it?" Thomas's voice came out small. "I'm not your real son." The wind roared around them. Caleb did not hesitate. "No," he said. "You're not." Thomas flinched. Caleb reached forward, firm but steady, gripping the boy's shoulders. "You're the son I chose." The words hung heavy and unpolished. Chosen. Not by accident. Not by blood. By decision. Thunder cracked overhead. Thomas's eyes filled, not with panic this time. With something breaking open. "You stayed," Thomas whispered. "I'll always stay," Caleb replied. And this time, it wasn't a vow made in fear. It was truth settled in bone. By the time they rode back, the storm had fully broken. Rain lashed the plains. Eleanor met them halfway, soaked through, relief flooding her face when she saw Thomas safe in the saddle. She didn't scold him. She didn't question. She simply placed a hand over his small one as they rode the rest of the way together. 3 figures against the storm. Not scattered. United. The next confrontation did not wait. Davenport arrived 2 days later with official papers demanding immediate review under claims of emotional instability in the child's placement. Caleb read the document slowly. "He ran," Davenport said smoothly. "That suggests insecurity." Caleb stepped forward. "He ran because your lies chased him." Davenport's gaze flicked to Eleanor. "And because town whispers reach small ears." Eleanor did not retreat. "Then perhaps the town should learn silence," she said evenly. Davenport's smile thinned. "You can't marry him fast enough to fix this." The insult was deliberate. Caleb's fists tightened. Eleanor's chin lifted. "This has nothing to do with marriage," she said calmly. "It has to do with commitment." Davenport scoffed. "Commitment requires stability." Caleb's voice dropped, steady as iron. "Then come see it." The demonstration happened on Sunday. Not by court order. By Caleb's demand. If Briar Hollow wanted community endorsement, it would witness the truth. The entire town gathered at the Mercer Ranch. Men leaned on fences. Women whispered near the porch. Children ran through the yard. Davenport stood near the front, arms folded. Caleb did not prepare a speech. He prepared evidence. Thomas read aloud from a book Eleanor had given him. His voice wavered at first. Then strengthened. He solved arithmetic problems on the chalkboard nailed to the barn wall. He showed the small vegetable patch he had planted. He saddled a horse under Caleb's supervision. Not perfectly. But confidently. Then Caleb spoke. I don't claim to be perfect, he said plainly. I don't claim to know everything about raising a child. He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. But I show up. Every day. I feed him. I teach him. I listen when he's afraid. He looked directly at Davenport. I don't measure worth by acreage. Silence spread across the yard. Then Eleanor stepped forward. If Briar Hollow believes children should be raised where they are wanted, she said clearly, then you have your answer. Mrs. Daughtry shifted uncomfortably. Sheriff Colin nodded slowly. The tide was turning. Not dramatically. But undeniably. That night, after the town dispersed, Thomas sat between Caleb and Eleanor on the porch steps. The sky was clear again. Stars steady overhead. Are we in trouble? Thomas asked softly. Caleb considered the question. Yes, he said honestly. Probably always will be. Thomas frowned. Why? Because doing right don't always mean doing easy. Thomas thought about that. Then leaned lightly against Caleb's side. Eleanor watched the gesture. She did not look away when Caleb met her eyes. There was no dramatic confession. No sweeping declaration. Just understanding. This wasn't about proving something to town anymore. It was about protecting something already built. And Caleb knew now, without doubt, what made a father. It wasn't blood. It wasn't law. It wasn't approval. It was staying when running felt easier. And loving when the world suggested distance. The final hearing would come soon. Davenport would not surrender quietly. But Caleb Mercer was no longer a lone cowboy guarding his solitude. He was a father defending his son. And beside him stood a woman who had chosen the same fight. The final hearing was set for early spring, when the frost had just begun to loosen its grip on the earth. Briar Hollow had not known a season so restless. Some said Caleb Mercer had made his point. Others insisted Davenport would never allow the adoption to pass without one last strike. The town had divided itself quietly, not into loud enemies, but into measured watchers. Caleb did not concern himself with watchers anymore. He concerned himself with Thomas. The boy had stopped flinching at thunder. He had started laughing more freely. And sometimes, in the early mornings before chores, Caleb would hear him humming softly to himself while pulling on boots that were still slightly too large. It was a fragile thing, that kind of peace. And Caleb guarded it like he would guard the last ember in a storm. The morning of the hearing, Thomas dressed carefully. He insisted on buttoning his own shirt. Eleanor helped him smooth his hair, though it refused to lie flat. You look respectable, she said gently. Thomas glanced at Caleb. Do I look like a son? The question caught in Caleb's chest. You look exactly like mine, he answered. Thomas nodded once, satisfied. They rode into town together. Not separated. Not cautious. Together. The courthouse felt different this time. Quieter. Less curious. More deliberate. Sheriff Collins stood near the entrance and tipped his hat as they passed. Mrs. Daughtry gave a tight nod, not warm, but no longer hostile. Davenport stood at the front again, but there was less confidence in the way he held himself. The clerk began. This court reconvenes regarding the formal adoption petition of Thomas Reed by Caleb Mercer. He adjusted his papers. Since the prior hearing, evidence has been submitted regarding the child's welfare, education, and stability within the Mercer household. A pause. Community testimonials have also been received. That caused a stir. Caleb hadn't asked for testimonials. He hadn't known. The clerk continued. Miss Eleanor Whitfield submitted written observations. Sheriff Collins submitted character testimony. Several townspeople have attested to the child's improvement and visible security. Davenport shifted, jaw tightening. The clerk looked over his spectacles. Mr. Davenport, do you have further objection? Davenport stepped forward slowly. For the record, he said carefully, my concern has always been the child's long-term stability. Caleb met his gaze steadily. Stability, Davenport continued, requires permanence. It does, Caleb agreed. Davenport's eyes flicked toward Eleanor. Then I ask, what permanence exists in a household built on rumor? The implication was sharp but tired. This was his final card. The room waited. Caleb did not look at Eleanor immediately. He looked at Thomas. Then he stepped forward. "You're right," Caleb said evenly. "Permanence matters." A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. Caleb turned, not toward Davenport. Toward Eleanor. The silence deepened. "Miss Whitfield," he said, voice steady though quieter than usual, "you've stood beside me when you didn't have to. You've defended my home. You've helped raise this boy." Eleanor's breath stilled. Caleb removed his hat. "I don't have polished words," he continued. "But I know what staying means now. And I know I don't want to build this family halfway." The room felt suspended. "I would be honored," he said simply, "if you would marry me. No kneeling. No grand flourish. Just truth." A few gasps broke through the room. Thomas's eyes widened. Eleanor looked at Caleb, not shocked, not flustered. Thoughtful. Careful. She stepped forward. "You are not asking to solve a problem," she said quietly. "No. You are asking because you choose us." "Yes." Her composure softened. "Then my answer is yes." The word landed gently. But it changed everything. Thomas let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. The clerk cleared his throat, though a faint smile tugged at his lips. "Given the testimony presented," he said, "and the clear demonstration of intent toward a stable household, this court approves the formal adoption of Thomas Reed by Caleb Mercer." The gavel struck. Once. Final. Thomas didn't wait for permission this time. He threw his arms around Caleb's waist. "Pa," he said firmly. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. Then held him tight. Eleanor rested a hand on both of them. 3 figures. No longer questioned. Recognized. Davenport left without another word. His boots echoed sharply against the wooden floor. He had lost. Not to sentiment. Not to spectacle. But to persistence. The wedding was small. Briar Hollow attended out of curiosity at first. But curiosity softened into something warmer as they watched. Caleb stood straight but nervous. Eleanor wore a simple cream dress she had mended herself. Thomas stood between them, holding both their hands. When the vows were spoken, they were not ornate. Caleb promised to stay. Eleanor promised to stand. And Thomas promised, in a whisper too quiet for most to hear, "I'll never run again." Years later, the Mercer Ranch no longer felt like a house that had once been empty. Laughter echoed often. The schoolhouse expanded, thanks to Eleanor's insistence and Caleb's labor. Thomas grew taller, steadier. He rode like a boy who had learned balance early. One evening, as the sun dipped low across the plains, Thomas, no longer 7 but nearing manhood, sat beside Caleb on the porch. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Regret what?" "Choosing me." Caleb leaned back in his chair. "I regret a lot of things in my life," he admitted. "But not that." Thomas nodded slowly. "You stayed," he said again. Caleb smiled faintly. "So did you." Across the yard, Eleanor called them in for supper. Her voice carried warmth now, no longer restrained by town whispers. Caleb rose, clapping a hand on Thomas's shoulder. The plain stretched wide and golden before them. Once, Caleb had believed strength meant standing alone. Now he understood better. Strength meant building something that could weather storms. Strength meant choosing people and letting them choose you back. And as they stepped inside together, father, mother, son, Briar Hollow no longer saw a lone cowboy. They saw a family no one expected. But one that had been built the only way that ever truly lasts. By staying.